Welcome, everyone. My name is Annette Johns, and I'm the Associate Director of Policy and Practice with the Newfoundland and Labrador Association of Social Workers. I have the honor of being the moderator for today's education event, Maintaining Mental Health in a Time of Uncertainty. We have over 240 social workers from across Newfoundland and Labrador tuning in this morning. This webinar is a collaboration between the Newfoundland and Labrador Association of Social Workers and the Canadian Association of Social Workers. As social workers, we know that COVID-19 has greatly impacted the health and social well-being of individuals, families, and communities throughout our province, and indeed worldwide. During this public health emergency, social workers have continued to provide a vital role in the continuation of service delivery, working with those who are our most vulnerable, those who have experienced loss in many different capacities, and those experiencing heightened mental health challenges. Social workers continue to play a vital and integral role in keeping our community safe, and for this we sincerely thank you. The webinar today, which explores the impact of COVID-19 through the process of grief and change, is important in our work with clients and also for our personal and professional well-being. The webinar presentation will be approximately 45 minutes with 15 minutes for questions. Please send in your questions throughout the presentation. Only myself and the presenter will see them. All the housekeeping digits you need are included in the housekeeping widget that popped up when you first logged in. I now want to introduce our speaker, Simone Pelly. Simone is a registered social worker with the NLASW. She is chair of our ethics committee and member of the editorial committee. I have the pleasure of working with Simone on both these committees. We have had many interesting and insightful ethical discussions, and Simone has written many articles for Connecting Voices. For almost 15 years, Simone has worked with children, families, and adults in the field of mental health and wellness in New Brunswick and Newfoundland and Labrador. Simone is a diplomat and certified member of the Academy of Cognitive Therapy. This certification is awarded to mental health professionals who have demonstrated an advanced level of expertise in cognitive behavioral therapy. She provides cognitive behavioral therapy at her private practice in Gander, Newfoundland and Labrador. I will now pass things over to Simone to begin the presentation.
Okay, good morning, everybody. This is the first time we've tried the webcam. We have done it before using dial-in and me being on the telephone, but we thought we'd give this a go this time. And we had a few technical difficulties just before we started, so it might take me a couple of minutes to calm down because we were right down to the wire getting it sorted. Thank you for having me today, and welcome to the presentation. This presentation today is going to be a general overview of grief and adaptation in a time of profound change. It's not going to be like therapy when I work with an individual where I tailor the information to that person based on their unique experiences, their unique background, and any mental health presentation that they might come in with. So I ask that when we go through the presentation, feel free to disregard what's not relevant, but I hope really at the end of the day that you'll all take something away that might be relevant to you in your own lives, in your professional practice, in working with your clients, and in relating to your friends and families. What we're going to do today is we're going to look at the grief reactions, and hopefully as we kind of go through that process of grief reaction, adaptation to change, we can understand a little bit more about our own process and how this relates to all of the change that we have happening right now. All right. Does anybody remember February? It just seems like such a long time ago. I decided to use that picture because right at the end of February, before everything changed, I was at Disney. My kids are grown, but I'm a little bit of a Disney fan myself. And while I was there, I took this picture, and I really, when I looked back at my pictures after I came home from my vacation, it really signified a lot of the change that we've all had. our restrictions on international travel, even our restrictions on interprovincial travel, and non-essential travel throughout the province, although that now is being loosened up. But of course, it could be tightened up as time goes on, and depending on how things evolve with the current public health emergency. When I look at that picture now, I see a huge crowd with people so close together. And at that time, I didn't even know what the term social distancing meant. But clearly, we're not social distancing there. It also makes me think of gatherings in general and the rituals and the things that we do to join as a community in order to get comfort in crisis and to have connection and a sense of belonging. And all those things have changed. Now, I'm from Mount Pearl. I grew up in Mount Pearl, and I was in town doing some shopping and grocery shopping, and we were it was at the stage that we were allowed to start walking back down through the parks again, and I was taking a walk through Bowring Park, and I looked up at a hill where, as a child, it seemed a lot bigger at the time, we used to run up to the top of the hill, lie down, and roll all the way to the bottom. And when we would do that, we would stand up, we would feel dizzy, disoriented, and yet we'd have to figure out a way to go back up the hill again and do it all over again. And that's how I liken the image for us today in terms of dealing with change. It's as if we've been in a jar, we've been shaken up and thrown out, and we're all feeling a little dizzy, a little disoriented, not quite sure where the ground is, and our way back up the hill and figure out a way to do life all over again. Now, before we get into the presentation, I thought it might be important just to kind of identify what it is, what the goal of the presentation is today. And this is really about maintaining mental health. So I sometimes do talks on mental illness and particularly cognitive therapy as treatment for mental illness. But today we're going to be focusing on the mental health part of the continuum. I really like this diagram because it helps us understand the difference between mental health and mental illness. So the World Health Organization defines positive mental health as a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. So when you look at this diagram, I actually borrowed this from an article in Psychology Today. I really like the plot and how it's laid out, and that it is divided up on 4 separate axes. And if we were to look at the example of the right-hand side, a person with high mental health and low mental illness would be a person who is generally in good mental health and doesn't have an active mental illness like a depression or an anxiety disorder or a bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. But if we move to the other side of that axis, still on the top, you can see that a person can have high mental illness and yet have high mental health. And when I used to work in community mental health, I worked with a group of men, conducting a cognitive therapy group for men with schizophrenia. And there I was working with men who had a serious mental health diagnosis, but yet they were actively engaging in the recovery plan, taking their medication, involved with their families, and pursuing their own recovery goals. So while they did have a high level of mental illness, they also at the same time maintained high mental health. So that illustrates the difference when we talk about mental health, which everybody has, and mental illness with which a proportion of the population does have at any given time. So it's important to me to also identify that if you are noticing a change in your mental health, a higher level of stress, difficulty coping with the challenges of everyday life, maybe a shift in mood, and you're not quite sure is possibly the beginning of an anxiety disorder or depression and transition response, there are certainly resources that you can access to be able to get more information. I always say that one great person to go to, if you're fortunate enough to have a family doctor or a community health clinic and a nurse practitioner and someone who knows you and knows your baseline, that it's always good to make an appointment, and that's a great place to have a conversation with your questions about your mental health and whether or not you might be experiencing a mental illness. I also listed out the Employee Assistance Program. For a good portion of you here today, you likely have access to an EAP program through your employer or also through your health insurance. And then, of course, we have our community mental health services, mental health and addiction services all throughout the province. We have the online program through Bridge the Gap. And, of course, we have our mental health crisis line. All right. No one ever told me that grief felt so like fear. C.S. Lewis. So C.S. Lewis is the author of the children's books of Narnia. But he also wrote shortly after the loss of his wife, and it was called A Grief Observed. And in that book, this was actually the first line of the book, and I really liked the illustration of it. Basically encapsulates the theme of the book and the theme of what we're going to be talking about today. That for him, when his wife passed away, he really had lost not just his life partner, but a sense of who he was, his identity, and his future, and the loss of the dream of the future. That the life that he once knew, he no longer had. And this book was exploring that loss and questioning his values, questioning, in his case, his own faith, questioning his identity, and trying to get reoriented, trying to get set back up so he could forge out a life for himself. And when we talk about the process of grief, which I'm going to go into next as a universal experience, I'm going to go through the stages. And in those stages, fear really isn't outlined, but it's most certainly expressed whenever I work with a person who has a sudden change in their life and they're venturing out into the unknown and they don't know really what's going to come next. So a lot of times in my practice, people come in and they're surprised to find out that they're actually going through a grief process. A lot of times they'll say to me, but I thought you only grieve when you lose a loved one, when somebody you care about dies. And I explain there's lots of losses that we can have in our life. And as many of you already well know, the loss of work, the loss of a relationship, the loss of a long-term friendship, the loss of income, the loss of a life plan that didn't otherwise work out. And in particular, right now, in this time of COVID-19, the loss of a sense of overall safety, the loss of a sense of what's normal, and the loss of the things that really we would otherwise use to generally cope, and the things that we usually use to maintain our mental health. So Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, a psychiatrist, identified the 5 stages of grief. And she basically said that these stages, of course, are not linear, that you can experience them at any point as you're going through a loss. And they can be either denial, anger, bargaining, despair, and acceptance. And honestly, if you want to see any of these examples, you could clearly look to social media at any given time of the day and probably see any of these stages appear. I've got a bit of a cough, sorry, so I might have to take my puffer and take a minute. All right. So the first stage of grief is denial. And that is the belief that you probably saw at the beginning, and maybe you're still seeing it, and it's also in the media and social media, and that's that the media has overblown everything. Oh, it's just like the flu. Most people will get over it and recover, and that's the end of it, and it's not a big deal. Well, denial also serves a function. Denial is the thing that we often feel shortly after the shock of the loss. And it's the thing that helps us focus on survival mode. It helps us focus on what we need to do in order to get things done. And we sometimes block out everything else because we really just want to cope on what's before us. So it actually serves an adaptive purpose, but sometimes it can be maladaptive because it can slow the process of a person coming to grips with what's actually happening in the environment. And we all know at the beginning of this pandemic, from the date that the pandemic was declared on March 11th, to right after the St. Patrick's Day weekend, we had a series of changes. It was just one thing after another. Things were being shut, people were being sent home, and many people were describing themselves as like, what is this a dream? What's actually happening? It's hard to take in all that information. So denial does serve an adaptive purpose. But often, we talk about kind of the costs and the benefits of each, but held on too longly, it can slow the process working through grief. All right. So, anger. Now, this picture isn't actually meant to be a political statement. It just struck me funny. Because on one side, you've got some guys who are clearly protesting the lockdown, and they're saying, we're revolting. And then you've got the lady on the other saying, I agree. So it's a play on words. Both of them are actually expressing their own anger in their own way. And you probably also saw a lot of this on the news. You may still see this on the news. You see it, we are seeing it on the news right now with what is happening in the States and the legitimate protests that are occurring, but then kind of the added uncontrolled violence that's also happening and clearly a manifestation of some uncontrolled rage. Angry thoughts, shut it down. Or, I can't believe the ignorance of some people. The arrows on the floor at Walmart are there for a reason. We have our rights. We can't be chained to our house forever. I need to work to support my family. This isn't fair. Bargaining. So this is when a person starts to open up to the idea that things are not the same, but they're not quite at the place where they're into acceptance. So they're kind of bargaining with the idea of renegotiating what was normal before and trying to make it practical or preserve it so that it could maybe be used in the present. It's okay to visit with friends as long as everyone washes their hands. Now, of course, as we're moving down through our alert system, our bubbles are expanding and the public health regulations are evolving and changing. This will be over by Easter and we'll all go back to normal. I've got a cruise booked for October. I'm looking for deals for a flight. And then despair. Again, it's a very natural process. So when I work through grief with people, the level of sadness and despair and even hopelessness that a person feels may feel that it could be, leading into a depression. But yet a level of sadness and hopelessness is natural and normal. I'm not allowed to work. I may not even have a job that I can come back to. This is hopeless. This has taken away everything I love. What's the point of going on? My health is high risk. I'm going to get sick and there'll be no help for me. And then what we understand as being the last stage of grief, and what we traditionally understood as the last stage of grief is acceptance. Now, in my next slide, I'm going to talk about a psychologist by the name of David Kessler, or actually, I'm not sure if he was a psychologist, but he was a grief researcher, and he worked closely with Dr. Kubler-Ross, and they had further developed this last stage 5 of grief, acceptance, into 3 further categories, which we'll touch on next. But acceptance language that you'll often hear from people. I can't control what happens in the future, but today I can stay at home, take care of my children, and follow the directions of public health. Even though I can't be with my family nor my friends, I can connect with them by phone or video. And in the meantime, I can focus on those who live in my household and are in my bubble. Once I return to my daily routine, or once I return to work, my daily routine will be challenging, but I'll learn the new procedures like I first did back when I started my career. So this is what I was talking about, the 6th stage of grief by David Kessler. This is from his book that you can find called Finding Meaning, the 6th Stage of Grief. And he introduces it that they never really intended for acceptance to be final. That to even clarify more, that when a person moves successfully through the grief process, there are some other things that have to occur. And that's acknowledgement, managing, and then ultimately finding meaning. So, acknowledge. For each of us, when we're going through a change, one of the most important things to do is to be able to identify what the change is, to be able to name the loss, and notice the negative emotions and thoughts that show up. Now, I wrote down acceptance, and that process of acceptance is really in the context of what we understand as a mindfulness technique. And there's been lots of presentations on mindfulness. If you go online to Bridge the Gap, there's actually some mindfulness teaching that's on there. Basically, as some or most of you are aware, mindfulness is the process of paying attention on purpose in the present moment. And that is a process that we can use for acknowledgement and acceptance, that we can actually notice the emotions that are coming up, allow them to happen, and take some time to be able to process them and listen to them and see what they have to tell us. It's important here that we remember that if we avoid negative emotions, and of course, we avoid negative emotions by doing all kinds of things. Sometimes we can just cognitively shut them out and focus on other things. Sometimes we might engage in habitual behaviors, compulsive behaviors that might help us numb and block out emotions. Sometimes we can, sometimes people drink and use substances to numb emotions. But in order to work through grief, eventually the emotions do have to be felt and acknowledged. So what is it that we have to acknowledge? Well, we have to acknowledge the loss of normalcy. And this is really important. The rug's been taken out from under us, and how we knew that we lived and conducted our lives has been changed, and we don't know for how long. And to add insult to injury, really, a lot of the things that we've always done to cope, as I said at the beginning of this presentation, are no longer available to us. Hanging out with friends and connecting. Going to the gym and working out. Lots of people use that as regular stress management. Going to a yoga class so that you can be with a group and collectively practice the stretching and do the mindfulness exercises. Massage therapy. Some of these things will be coming back online now in the next few weeks. And hopefully, as long as things remain stable, that we'll be able to maintain them. Meeting friends for dinner after work. and just being concerts, music, art, all of the activities, even travel, and exploring new places, all of those things that really are actually a manifest part of our personality and helps us manage our stress, it's all been changed. Acknowledge the loss of connection and belonging. And thankfully, now in the stage that we're in, we're beginning to branch out and we're able to expand our connections, this next level now to the people who are our supports and our primary contacts. But yet, throughout this process, people with pre-existing health conditions and people who are advanced in age, so our grandparents, our elders in our community, the people that may also even suffer from isolation more so than the younger generation, are not going to have the same amount of contact, and that continues to be an ongoing loss. We have to acknowledge the loss of safety. One of the things we'll talk about a little bit more is kind of estimating level of risk and evaluating our level of risk. But the facts remain, as Dr. Fitzgerald tells us every day, the virus is still with us. And depending on our health situation, depending on pre-existing conditions, depending on our age, there are just different levels of risk. And it is demanding that each of us now be hyper-aware, hyper-vigilant, engage in rituals that we may not, well, definitely in terms of social distancing and mask wearing, that we haven't ever done before. And it is a constant reminder that there is an invisible threat out there. That threat varies depending on each person, but it still remains. And I know that all of us also still want to participate in keeping those who are most vulnerable safe. So we can't help but have a heightened awareness of the change in our level of safety. The loss of efficiency. This is a really common one that I hear in my work and I hear amongst my colleagues and even myself I'm struggling with. This picture really made me giggle the first time I saw it, the 4 horsemen of procrastination. Napping, snacks, I think internet games, and then and I have found that when it comes to doing my regular work, my feet do drag as well on documentation and note-taking and the paperwork things. And I do have to try to bring my attention back and bargain with myself in order to maintain a certain level of productivity. But it's really important, too, that we exercise self-compassion, that it's okay, that our brains are trying to catch up with our reality and that change is exhausting. And that the truth of the matter is that our efficiency levels have changed. And we've only got so much cognitive resources in a day and only so much energy that we can invest in the tasks that we have to do. It's important to set small goals, do things in shorter periods of time, take breaks, and all of that, on top of the people who are working from home and also having to manage family at home as well and managing homeschooling, all of those things take energy. And just trying to adapt to all of the changes, it's going to slow us down. We're just going to be less efficient, but it's okay. So, which there's a good segue now into the important part of acknowledgement, which is self-compassion. As health workers and social workers, we generally are compassionate people. We have high levels of compassion in our personality, and we find a lot of meaning in helping others. But sometimes there can be a bit of a double standard. And that same compassion that we have for people, we're a little short on it for ourselves. So one of the things I talk about in my practice and with other colleagues, and even I have to remind myself, is a daily practice of self-compassion. And that comes down to validating feelings. Feelings are legitimate. Emotions are what they are. They have something to tell us. And a good way to experience an emotion, or I guess I shouldn't say good because that is a judgment, an effective way to manage emotion is really to look at it with a mindful curiosity. What is it? Why is it there? What has it got to tell me? Is it a signal that's telling me that I am undergoing a high degree of stress? I'm struggling. But it's also important to notice should thoughts that come up. Thoughts like, oh, I shouldn't feel this way. Or what's wrong with me? Why can't I snap out of this? Those are thoughts, they're self-judgment thoughts. And they actually can heap on misery. We can add to our own misery. One of the sayings that I repeat over and over again is that misery lies in the land between expectations and reality. The reality is right now we're in a continued state of flux and we don't know what the future holds. The expectations that we have on ourselves have got to change, because if they're too high, that's the land where we can experience extra misery. And really, as we're working through this, the goal is to reduce misery wherever we can. So if we just adjust our expectations to match the reality of the situation and give ourselves that self-compassion, identify when we're being critical and telling ourselves that we don't have to listen to that critical voice, that it's okay and that we will get through this. And reminding ourselves that everyone makes mistakes. Everyone experiences difficulty at times. And take it one day at a time and just focus on the task at hand. All right, so this moves into the next step, which is manage. Managing uncertainty and fears of the future. I'm sure that all of you have experienced one or more of these thoughts, and I know that they continually go through my mind. How long will this go on? What will it be like over the coming months? When can I get back to work? And if you're already working from home, when can I get back to the office? When can the kids get back to school? And what will my work be like when I do return to the office? Or when can I get back to seeing clients in person? And how's that going to happen? And how's that going to work? Someone said to me a couple of weeks ago, one thing we know sure is we know. But as human beings, we desperately seek. It's an evolutionary aspect, I think, really, and it comes down to survival. That 100 years ago, a lot of changes happened over the last 100 years, and we do live in a relatively safe environment now, from one day to the next. But even 100 years ago, during the last pandemic, we did not have the resources available to us at that time. We did not have the technology that can be used now for contact tracing. We didn't have the media support that we had in order to give us the daily updates and the public health information that they're giving us every day. And our brains still haven't really caught up to this new safe way of life. We still strive for ground and predictability. We still like to keep things, or to keep a sense of control. The only problem with that is uncertainty still abounds. Our future at any given time is unknown, but especially in times of crisis and this public health emergency. So strong feelings of uncertainty activate strong desire to control. But there's a catch-22. Trying to achieve 100% control and 100% certainty in any situation is impossible. And if we demand 100% certainty, it only serves to actually make our anxiety worse our fears worse, and make our sense of uncertainty even that more profound, because it maintains this vicious cycle of fear. Our efforts to control increases our feelings of no control. So it's a paradoxical effect. At the beginning of this pandemic, I found myself scrolling on those darn minute-by-minute updates on CNN and Global News, and just scrolling because I just wanted to get as much information as I could. I don't know why I needed the information. Most of it wasn't even relevant to Newfoundland and Labrador, but for some reason I felt that that was going to give me a sense of control, and it really didn't. And I'd find myself, I would get myself in this unproductive, anxious spin, and then it would take away from my ability to focus on my daily responsibilities. So it's important to keep things in perspective. Really what we have to do is we have to focus on the things that we can control, the things that are in our control today. So the goal is really to reduce and limit distress. When I work with a person individually, what we try to do is we try to limit the duration of distress, the frequency of distress, and the intensity of distress, all the while recognizing that the goal is never to erase distress. That even the distress has something to tell us. Like I was talking about earlier, we do have to feel a sense of unease and hypervigilance as we're out in the community, because we need to be aware. And our awareness is what helps us facilitate following the public health measures. So, it's important on focusing on what's in your control and what's not in your control. Identify which thoughts are in your control and which ones are not in your control today. So that's the difference between productive worry and unproductive worry. That is, if you notice in a stream of thoughts that you're being overcome about what's happening in the future, you have to ask yourself, can I do something about this today? And then go do it. But if you can't do something about this today, and you find that it's a worry that it can actually happen further down in the future, or it's a worry that you don't have any control over, then it's important to recognize that it's unproductive worry and see if you can shelf it, see if you can write it down, or make a promise to yourself that when that happens, I'll deal with it then. But for now, I've just got to deal with the things that I have to deal with today. I'm going to walk through a little exercise of modifying thoughts about what's not in our control, and then also changing our behaviors to address the immediate and practical needs in our control today. So, well, there's lots of thoughts one can identify in the context of what's occurring right now. What if I get sick? How will the kids keep up with school? I can't get anything done. Will I ever do my job safely? I miss my friends. I'm lonely. I can't pay all my bills. So, to identify thought that is in your control or not in your control. So productive worry, what can I do about this today? Or even what can I do about this week? And what's not productive worry, that could be something that may happen down the line and then you can actually deal with it, or something that you have absolutely no control over. So what if I get sick? Well, what's in my control today? I can continue to hand wash. I can monitor my health. I can follow the public health measures, and I can engage in social distancing. And when I'm not able to engage in social distancing now, I can wear a mask to help protect others. What's not in my control? The thought that might pop in someone's head, someone might sneeze on me at Costco. It might happen. However, it's not something that you can immediately change or do much about, except when you do get out again and you do your shopping, and then it becomes something in your immediate domain, and then you can engage in the social distancing measures, wear a mask to help protect others, and follow all the public health policies. All right. So when you notice that you have a thought that you really can't do anything about, it's really important to ask yourself some questions. So I thought I would list out some of the questions that I do from a cognitive therapy perspective when I'm working with someone with managing anxiety. Now, when I'm treating an anxiety disorder, the cognitive model of an anxiety disorder is a person overestimates the risk to themselves and they underestimate their ability to cope. And depending on which anxiety disorder it is, there's a collection of thoughts that a person experiences that they overestimate the risk, but they believe that even if it happens, that they can't cope. So that cognitive model can be applied today to when we're thinking about things that are uncertain and when we're worrying about things that are far in the future and they're not in our control. What is the risk? So actually evaluate the risk. This technique with the client is ask yourself, what's the worst that can happen? What's the best that can happen? What will likely happen? And how can I cope? Actually, just before the presentation, when Annette and I were setting this up and I was having trouble with my webcam, that's actually what I had said right out loud to myself and to Annette. All right, well, this is the worst that can happen. This is the best that can happen. This is what can likely happen. And this is what we'll do to cope with it, no matter what. What are my resources? Am I minimizing my ability to prevent or deal with the outcome of the risk? Again, right, the cognitive model being overestimating the risk and underestimating the risk. Is the person, or am I underestimating my ability to handle it? So if it actually did happen, who can help me? What resources can I turn to? And sometimes entertaining the worst case scenario helps, because you can actually go through an exercise of what resources to draw on, what people can be most helpful, and what do you already know? And then you can come up with a plan. So if the worst happens, you're ready to go. And am I feeling the feelings of fear? And how can I practice acceptance? When I work with people with anxiety, sometimes their world gets smaller and smaller because they're avoiding the place where they first experienced the anxiety. And while they think that they're protecting themselves because they're staving off that experience of anxiety, they're losing other things through the process. They're losing the social contact that maybe they're afraid to engage in. They're losing in the social activity and all the benefits that might go along with that. And so there are limited places we can go now, but if we start to avoid them for fear of feeling fear there, our world risks getting even smaller. And I just have this table again. And I'm sorry, because I know I'm going through this quickly, but again, where you could use this table, and this is something I use with clients to identify what the worried thought is. Am I exaggerating the risk? What's the worst that can happen? What's the best that can happen? What's most likely to happen? What are my resources? And can I practice acceptance? All right, so the last thing that I want to talk about today, and that's changing our behaviors to address the immediate and practical needs that we control today. And I want to borrow the techniques from acceptance and commitment therapy. The great thing about cognitive therapy is that the thing that's unique about cognitive therapy is the cognitive conceptualization, the structure of the sessions that we provide, and kind of the process in which it's delivered. And there's a little bit more on YouTube on a presentation that I did last year. I think it was more than a manual. But cognitive therapy also allows for borrowing tools and techniques from other therapeutic approaches. And I really like this one when I'm working with a client who is trying to sort out reestablishing a sense of meaning in their life. A lot of time when I work with young people, and especially young people experiencing a depression, they'll say, but what's the point? What's the meaning of all this? And then we'll go through this exercise to start zoning in on that young person's values, what brings them meaning, and then how they can link their values, their sense of meaning, to their values and into values-based action. So, values-based goal setting for changing behavior. So even in this time of crisis, getting back to what's important to you, what makes you tick, it can serve as a compass to orient you to the path forward. In a time of crisis, it can be difficult to figure out what to do or how to prioritize needs. One way of getting oriented is to identify your values, to how you want to live before you figure out what you need to do. It's like a compass that gives you direction in the way that you want to go. Values help us find the why in what we do. Just like in our CASW Code of Ethics, it outlines 6 primary values that we have to embody as social workers that guide and inform all the practice and the actions, the interactions that we have with clients. So, what's important to you? What makes you tick? What you stand for? What are the qualities you want to see or you want others to see in you? Patience, reciprocity, mastery, beauty, cooperation, friendship, truth, service. There's a little exercise you can download online for free. It's an acceptance and commitments exercise called the Bullseye Values exercise. And it basically takes you through a bullseye diagram like the one here you can see on your screen. And it helps you orient what your values are in accordance to each of your domains of your life. And how you can pursue those values, even in the current crisis, and how you can live out those values so that you really kind of feel in line. So the things that you stand for are in line with the things that you do. And when you look at the bullseye, the further out the circle, the further away you are hitting the mark from feeling like you're in the zone, that you've lost touch with your values. But if you move further in, that's where you want to be, where you're fully living by them. So some examples of values in relationships are love, honesty, connection, humor, family, generosity, responsibility, cooperation, teamwork, follow through, respect, precision, creativity, and flexibility. Those values are in work. Some of these overlap. Of course, we can use them in our everyday lives. Leisure, fun, teamwork, music, sportsmanship, humor, creativity, beauty, and nature. Personal growth and health, fitness, literacy, healthy foods, mastery, service, and contribution. All of those things, I mean, everybody in this presentation can probably identify with some of these values. And these are the things that you keep in line as you're trying to decide how to move forward and how do I make meaning out of this great adjustment that we're all demanded to do. So I'll just give you an example. In translating those values into the action today, you have to prioritize your needs according to your values. And this is what I do as an exercise with clients as they're kind of working through loss or working through recovery of an illness and trying to find where they fit in the world. So a painful thought could be, I miss my family. And what's the problem that we have to solve today? Social isolation. What are the values that are important to you that can guide your choices and what you're going to do? Relationship values, belonging and connection. All right, so how are we going to pursue belonging and connection in order to address isolation? Well, I have a young person, when they're talking, and we've done this a number of times already, about reconnecting with their friends through the limits of the public health order, FaceTime, online games, online video games, phone calls. I even encourage some of the youth just get back to the old way of letter writing or sending a card in the mail. A couple of them did that and reported on how great, and their friends said how great it was that nobody gets anything in the mail anymore. Another painful thought, I can't pay my bills. My income does not match my expenses. All right. Well, when you're prioritizing your values, relationship values and responsibility are really important in this. So family values take priority over maybe leisure values. So reduce all non-essential expenses, seek financial advice from a qualified advisor. Those are the things that really ground a person. So it actually connects you to who you are, what makes you tick, and how you can move through even with all of the things that have been completely turned upside down. And I want to leave you with this quote at the end of the presentation. It really does, I think, sum things up for me. And that's Friedrich Nietzsche, the existential philosopher. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how. When I work with people who have had traumatic loss and significant change, usually when we go back and we start to move through this, a person will tell me their why. Why, or their who, and often it is a who, they've made the decision to carry on and to pick up their pain and to make great self-sacrifices and be courageous and carry on. And it's really important through this process that we not minimize the impact that we feel from this. We are not all affected in the same way. And our province really has been preserved so far from the great tragedy that other nations have had to experience. But that doesn't still minimize the loss that we can all feel and the change and the required adaptation that we have to take on in our life. So I hope this presentation was useful and helpful for you today. And I hope that you'll be able to take something from this to be able to use in your own life, in your own professional practice, or in with your families or working with your clients. Thank you very much. And I guess I'll hand it over now to Annette for some questions.
Thanks, Simone. That was a wonderful presentation. So we do have a bit of time for some questions. So if you do have any questions that you want to submit, please feel free to do them now. We do have a few questions, and hopefully we'll get through everyone's questions, but keep them coming. One of the first questions we had, Simone, is in terms of how people can deal with thoughts like, you know, there are people out there who are suffering more than me, and what right do I have to feel grief when I know some of the other problems or issues that people are having seem to be much greater than what I'm experiencing?
Okay, that's a great question. That actually kind of ties into what I was just talking about there right at the end. That sometimes, a lot of times actually, we have a double standard and we don't exercise the same level of validation and self-compassion with ourselves. All of the strategies that I talked about today are completely applicable in that we can use with ourselves, and we can also use with people that we work with, whether it's our own kids or our family members or our clients. But it's really important to validate our emotions. Making comparisons. The truth of the matter is if I look down my street, there's always somebody that is going through something that I may perceive as being more difficult than me. We can look at that right now all over the world and see how the different countries are responding to the crisis and what they're having to manage through this crisis. And there's different levels of crisis. But the question I would ask is, when you have those thoughts, what's the impact? It's actually a therapeutic strategy some people do use, and in DBT it's used. Making comparisons can actually inspire someone towards action, where they can say, you know what, but in my life, and I have this, and I'm thankful for that, and that can motivate a person to plow forward and to be effective. But sometimes making comparison, and this is a unique experience, right? Making comparisons can have the opposite effect and feel like a tyrant and can turn into a self-critical voice where a person can believe that they're not worthy of their feelings, and who are they to be feeling as bad when there are other people that are much worse off. But as that heaps on misery. And so depending on which road you take, the question I would have to ask you is, when you have those thoughts, what's the resultant emotion? And if the resultant emotion is despair, hate, then that does interfere with one's ineffectiveness. And that the next step really is to validate and to use self-compassion encourage oneself to go on. And the other thing I want to touch on too is a lot of times people think that EAP or therapy are for people when things really get bad, they'll say. And I would argue, no, that's not the case at all. That EAP can be really helpful in times when a person is trying to manage a new stress and trying to forge a way forward. And in therapy, there's another opportunity to be able to identify those kinds of thoughts that can be roadblocks to a person's movement through grief.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Another question we had was around if you had any suggestions that parents could do to support their kids through their losses and the changes they're experiencing as a result of this pandemic.
Okay. So all of the things that I've touched on today really can be translated to working with your kids. I mean, of course, it has to kind of go through the lens of what's developmentally appropriate. But really, I mean, the first thing is honesty is the best policy with the information that a young person, you're a young person, whether it's a small child or whether it's an adolescent or whether it's a teen, and what might be most useful. Again, you really want to look at what we can control. So if it's a small child, talking about encouraging and teaching how to do hand washing and using resources that are available. Actually, Bridge the Gap has got a resource. Dr. Janine Hubbard, a developmental psychologist, did a talk on parenting during a pandemic. That's a great resource. There's also I wrote it down because I was going to mention it in the presentation. Oh yeah, there's a book that you can download online called Everybody, a picture book for children who are worried about coronavirus. And also on the website through the UK, there's www.mindheart.co, which is a little workbook. Now, if you notice your child really seems to be exceptionally anxious, a really good resource is this book, and I recommend this to all the parents that I work with kids with anxiety. It's called Freeing Your Child from Anxiety, Practical Strategies to Overcome Fears, Worries, and Phobias, and Be Prepared for Life from Toddlers to Teens. Because again, all of the techniques that I had gone through are important. It's important to validate your child's fears. It's important to help label them. It's important to help identify what's in their control and what's not in their control. And then it's really important to watch and see if there are any lasting effects with any of those fears, disrupted sleep, obsessive talking about it, an expression of worry, any changes in your child that you see that they're not quite themselves. And then it's a great idea just to take a trip into the doctor and, get an idea. Are you getting into the land of a true anxiety disorder issue, or is this something that can be allayed with good information and parenting help?
Excellent. Thanks, Simone. I think we do have time for one more question. The question is, have you heard of many people who actually feel anxiety and worry about returning to normal demands and whether or not they can manage this? The person says, I sometimes fear having to deal with the regular normal demands of life again.
Absolutely. Yes, right? Because it goes back to that, the fear that the normal demands just don't feel normal in a time of crisis, right? We have so much to juggle, whether that's family and the change in the family's routine. Even going to the grocery store right now is a major ordeal. And I only do it a couple times a month because even myself, when I get in there, I feel a little overwhelmed that I'm going to do something wrong and then somebody is going to give me an angry look or I'm going to bump into somebody. All of that requires a certain amount of cognitive energy. And that just compounds, it just amplifies the difficulty that even normal demands are. So it's an added burden. And so again, just to validate, yes, that is a theme that I hear from everyone. And it does require us to give ourselves a measure of self-compassion, that we pace our work. There's a couple of little things that I've noticed that I've done that have worked for me. One of them being I'll time myself. So I'll make a commitment to myself. Okay, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to do paperwork for 20 minutes and I'm going to set my timer. And when that 20 minutes is up, I'm going to go out, I'm going to walk around and have a cup of coffee and I'm going to reward myself. Then I'm going to come minutes of something else. Another thing that can be helpful too is giving yourself a bargain where I'll do one hard task and then 2 easier tasks, or one hard task and 5 easier tasks. So again, you just might have to mix up how you do the work in order to manage the extra burden.
Excellent, thank you. We did have another question in terms of the author of the anxiety book. Can you repeat who the author of that book was?
Yeah, it's Tamar E. Tansky. And she also wrote a really great book that I recommend when I work with kids with obsessive compulsive disorder. Freeing Your Child from Anxiety. It's on Amazon. I think it's about $15. So that's Tamar Chansky, Tamare Chansky, Chansky. It's a very user-friendly book, and I really, really like the chapter in it called The Parent Stance. I mean, if there's anything that you could share with a parent, or I would recommend, is chapter 10 to read. And then I find that if I provide a copy of that chapter, and then if the client, they find it helpful, then they can purchase the book for themselves on Amazon.
Wonderful. And I think that brings us to the end of the webinar. We're just about out of time there now. So I do want to take this opportunity to thank Simone for this stellar presentation and for sharing her knowledge, experience, and expertise with us today. Lots of great comments coming in, Simone, that I'll share with you after the webinar from people who have attended. Of course, these are indeed uncertain times, and COVID-19 has certainly challenged us in a way that we could never have anticipated, and 2020 is not the year we expected. We have witnessed many societal changes, and we must find ways to adjust to a new normal while keeping ourselves, our families, and communities safe. How we contextualize and understand what is happening around us is very important to our own mental wellness. And Simone certainly put that in context for us and provided us with a lot of great information that we can use not only in our own lives, but also in our work with clients. Simone, I look forward to continuing to work with you on our committees, and I thank you for taking time out of your schedule to facilitate this webinar today. It is truly, truly appreciated. For those who attended 45 minutes or more of the presentation, confirmation of attendance should now be available by clicking the yellow icon at the bottom right of your window, and members may claim 1 CPE credit under the required category of workshops as per the NLISW CPE policy for attending the webinar. We also ask that you complete the evaluation form that should appear on your screen. A recording of this webinar will be made available on the NLISW YouTube channel in the coming days as well. NLISW has a lot of information pertaining to COVID-19 and social work practice, including a frequently asked document that we have on our website, www.nlisw.ca. And information on this site is continuously updated, so we do encourage you to visit the website regularly. Recordings of previous NLISW webinars are also available for your viewing on the NLISW YouTube channel. And keep an eye out for registration for an NLISW webinar exploring technology use in social work practice. That will be happening on June 25th. So thanks again, everyone. Thanks again, Simone. Enjoy the rest of your day and stay safe.